When she was 9, her father held a lantern against the inside of a ship's hull and told her to watch the flame. It bent where the air came through, a thin, steady lean toward a seam no wider than a fingernail. She could smell tarred oakum and damp pine. He pressed a rope of caulking into the gap, and the flame straightened. Heat leaves through cracks before it leaves through walls, he said. She filed it away the way children do, without urgency, like a stone dropped into a pocket. 11 years later, on a ridge where her husband was dead and the wood was almost gone, she held a candle to a cabin wall and watched the flame bend sideways. And the pocket was not empty. The wagon had not even stopped rocking when the mill foreman pressed an envelope into Mara Bell Voss's hand and told her the company's obligation was settled. 23 years old, a dead husband wrapped in canvas in the bed behind her, $12 of burial wages in the envelope, and the foreman already turning away because the next log was rolling onto the carriage, and the saw does not wait for grief. Elias Voss had been dead 4 days by the time Mara drove the wagon back up the ridge trail above Redwood Creek. A redwood log had shifted on the skid at the Humboldt Bay mill camp, caught Elias across the chest, and pinned him to the mud. 3 men could not lift it. By the time they levered the log free, Elias was breathing through broken ribs that had already punctured something inside him. He died that night on a plank table in the cook shack, while a man he had never met held a lantern above the wound and said there was nothing left to hold together. Mara buried him in the settlement cemetery because the ridge had no church ground, and the soil up there was tangled with redwood roots too thick for a single woman to cut. She paid the gravedigger $3. She paid the minister $1. She kept the rest because the rest was everything. The ride back took 2 days. Rain fell the entire time. Her 12-year-old brother, Tobin Hale, sat beside her with a cough that had started before Elias died and had not stopped since. Tobin was not her child. He was her half-brother from a mother who had died in Portland and a father who had gone to sea and never come back. Mara had taken him because no one else would, and now he was the reason she could not simply walk off the ridge and find domestic work in Eureka or Arcata. A woman alone could find a kitchen. A woman with a sick boy could find nothing. The cabin stood where Elias had left it, which meant it stood badly. 14 by 16 feet of rough split redwood framing, half chinked with mud that had already cracked and fallen out in chunks along the north wall. The roof was split shakes, laid too thin, and rain came through in 3 places that Mara knew about, and probably more she would discover when the wind shifted. One stove, cast iron, with a cracked firebox plate that leaked smoke into the room whenever the draft turned wrong. A mud floor that sweated in rain and froze in cold snaps, and never once in 6 months had been anything a person would call dry. Mara climbed down from the wagon and stood in the doorway. The stove was cold. The woodpile beside the cabin was a stack of wet alder and redwood slash, maybe 1 1/4 quarts if she was generous in the measuring. She was not generous. She had learned already that generosity with numbers killed people up here faster than weather did. She had $18.70, 1 sack of flour, 3 pounds of dried beans, 2 candles, 1 dull axe with a handle that flexed when she swung it, 1 cross-cut saw with 3 broken teeth that Elias had meant to have repaired in town before the log caught him. And winter was not coming. Winter was here. The first hard rain had started in October, and it was now the 2nd week of November, and the clouds above the ridge had not broken in 9 days. Tobin coughed from the wagon bed, and Mara told him to stay wrapped in the quilts. She walked around the cabin once. The north wall had a gap near the base where she could see daylight through the chinking. The south corner post was sinking into the mud. The outhouse leaned east. The chicken coop, 3 hens, the 4th dead from something while they were gone, sat too close to the woodpile, which meant the wood smelled of droppings and the chickens were wet from runoff. She stood beside the woodpile and counted. 1¼ cords. She could stretch it to 6 weeks if she kept the fire small. 6 weeks would bring her to late December. Late December on this ridge meant the worst rain, the coldest nights, the possibility of wet snow when the inland wind pushed over the mountains. She would need at least 6 cords to make it through to March. She had 1¼ The gap was not something she could bridge by working harder. It was something that required money she did not have, time that had already passed, and a body that could swing an axe 8 hours a day. She did not have that body. She had the body of a woman who had been cooking in a mill camp and riding wagons for a week, and who had not eaten a full meal since the morning Elias left for the skid. The math was simple, and the math was fatal. That was the part no one said out loud, but Mara could count. Orson Vale came up the trail 3 days later, riding a gray mule that picked its way through the ruts with the deliberate patience of an animal that had been on bad roads before. Orson was 61 years old, retired from running ox teams on the logging roads, and he now served as the informal road overseer for the ridge settlement, which meant he checked on cabins after storms, decided when trails needed corduroying, and told people things they did not want to hear. He tied the mule to Mara's porch post, which wobbled, and he looked at the wobble, and then he looked at Mara, who was splitting wet alder with the dull axe and making poor progress. Orson did not offer sympathy. He had buried 2 wives himself, and he handled grief the way he handled a bogged wagon. You assessed the situation, named what was broken, and either fixed it or abandoned it. He walked the property. He looked at the woodpile. He pressed his hand against the north wall and felt the draft come through. He opened the stove door and studied the cracked plate. He checked the roof from inside and counted the drip spots by the water stains on the floor. Then he came outside and stood with his arms folded. "You have a cord and change," Orson said. "Wet, most of it. Your stoveplate is cracked, which means you are losing 1/3 of your heat through the firebox. That north wall might as well be open. Your roof will hold light rain, not heavy rain, and not snow." Mara set the axe down. "I know the numbers, Orson." "Then you know you need 6 cords seasoned to make March. You have not got 2. Your saw is broken. Your axe would not fell a willow. And you are one woman trying to do what 2 men could not always manage." "I am one woman with a sick brother." Orson looked toward the cabin, where Tobin's cough carried through the thin walls. "A ridge winter needs 6 cords of seasoned wood, a tight roof, and a man who can cut every clear day. You have none of those things. I am not being cruel. I am counting." "Then tell me what I should do." Orson rubbed his jaw. "Beam has green cordwood at $5 a cord. Hauling is extra. He will extend credit." "Against what?" "Against the claim." Mara stared at him. "Claude Beam wants this timber stand. He has wanted it since Elias filed. If I take his credit, I give him the leverage to take the claim when I cannot pay." "If you do not take his credit, you freeze." "Those are not the only 2 choices." Orson looked at the woodpile again, then at the sky, then at Mara. "I have been on this ridge 30 years, he said. "I've seen people try to winter on less. The ones who made it had help, money, or luck. You have none." He mounted the mule. At the trail's edge, he turned. "That stove will eat a cord before March, and you have not got March." Mara watched him go. The rain started again before he reached the first switchback. She went back to the alder round and swung the axe. The blade bounced. The wood was too wet to split cleanly, and the axe was too dull to force it. She swung again. Her blistered palms burned inside her gloves. Tobin appeared in the doorway, blanket around his shoulders, face flushed. "Is he right?" Mara split the round on the third swing. The halves fell into the mud. "Go back inside," she said. But the question Orson left was the one that sat in her chest and would not move. 6 cords needed, 1 1/4 on hand, no money, no saw, no help, and winter already biting. How could anyone survive that math? The answer, if there was one, would not come from counting cords. It came from a candle. 4 days after Orson's visit, a storm pushed up the coast and over the ridge with enough force to rattle the stovepipe and send smoke backing into the cabin. Mara stuffed rags into the north wall gap, but the draft was not coming only from the north wall. It was coming from the door seam, the floor joints, the window frame, the place where the stovepipe met the roof. The cabin was not a shelter. It was a sieve. Tobin lay on the cot with 2 quilts and Mara's coat piled on top of him. His cough had turned wet. His skin was hot to the touch. The stove was burning what should have been 2 days' worth of wood in one night, and the room was still cold enough that Mara could see her breath. She lit a candle, one of the 2 she had left, and held it near the door seam. The flame bent sideways. She moved it along the wall. The flame bent again. She moved it to the window frame. The flame bent. Everywhere she held the candle, the air was moving. The fire was not failing because it was too small. The fire was failing because the wind was stealing the heat faster than the wood could make it. And then her father's voice came back to her. Thomas Hale had been a ship caulker in Portland. He worked the seams of coastal freighters, packing oakum and tar into the gaps between planks to keep the ocean out. When Mara was 9, he had taken her to a hull he was finishing and held a lantern against the inside wall. The flame bent where the air leaked through an unfilled seam. He pressed a rope of tarred oakum into the gap, and the flame straightened. "Heat leaves through cracks before it leaves through walls," he said. "Fix the leak, and the fire you have becomes the fire you need." Mara had filed that lesson the way children file things adults say, without urgency, as a fact about the world that might matter later or might not. Her father had gone to sea and drowned when she was 12, and the lesson had lived in her memory for 11 years without once being useful. Now it was the only useful thing she had. She could not cut 6 cords. She could not buy 6 cords. She could not make the stove bigger or the winter shorter. But she could reduce how much heat the wind stole. If she could stop the leaks, the wood she had would burn longer, and the heat it made would stay. The problem was not fuel. The problem was air. The cabin was too far gone to fix in time. Too many gaps, too much exposed wall, a cracked stove plate she could not replace. She needed a space that was already tight, already sealed, already resistant to wind. 2 days later, searching for dry splinters along a fallen redwood, she found it. The stump rose 8 feet above the ground, the remnant of a tree that fire had hollowed decades earlier. A triangular opening at the base was wide enough for a person to crawl through. Mara almost passed it. She had seen hollow stumps before. Orson called them goose pens. Good for bears, good for boys hiding from chores, good for nothing else. But the air near the opening felt different. The wind that sliced through the ferns and soaked everything it touched simply stopped at the entrance. Mara crouched. She put her hand inside the opening. Still air, dry air. The smell was not rot. It was charcoal. She crawled in. The interior was larger than she expected, 6 feet across, maybe 7. The walls rose above her into darkness. The redwood had burned from the inside, and what remained was a shell of dense, fire-hardened wood at least a foot thick. The floor was dirt and old bark. Above the floor line, the walls were dry. Her hand brushed the surface, and instead of soft, punky wood, she felt something smooth. Smooth, too even. She could not see well enough to understand what she was touching. But the feeling stayed with her, the feeling that someone had been here before and had done something deliberate to these walls. The thought that formed was not a plan, it was a question. The hollow was already a room. It had thick walls that the wind could not reach. It had a roof of living bark and dead heartwood. It had a mouth that could be covered. If she could keep the floor dry, seal the entrance against wind without sealing it against air, and store dry fuel inside, this hollow could become the thing the cabin was not, a place where a small fire could actually warm a person. It was not a home. It was a last room. The first person to tell her it was foolish was Bethany Pike. Bethany lived half a mile down the ridge with 2 children and a husband who worked at a shingle mill near Orick and came home on weekends when the trail was passable. Bethany was 30, practical in the way that women with children and absent husbands become practical, and she had survived 3 winters on the ridge by knowing what worked and not wasting time on what did not. She found Mara on the marsh below the ridge, cutting tule-reeds with a kitchen knife. Mara's arms were scratched from the blade-edged leaves, and her boots were soaked through. She had a bundle of reeds on the bank that looked to Bethany like something a woman would cut if she were losing her mind. "What are those for?" Bethany asked. "Mats," Mara said. "For the door of the hollow." The hollow stump. "It is more than a stump. The inside is—" "Mara." Bethany set her gathering basket down. "I have seen those hollows. My children play in them. They are damp, they are dark, and they smell like old fire. You cannot heat a tree." "I am not trying to heat it. I am trying to stop the wind." Bethany studied her. "You are cutting reeds instead of cutting wood. Reed mats mildew. Hollow trees hold damp. You will wake up colder than you went in. The walls above the floor line are dry. The air inside does not move. If I can baffle the entrance, baffle. Block the wind without blocking all the air. 2 layers of mat hung with a gap between them. The wind hits the first mat and loses force. What gets through the first hits the second. Inside, the air sits still." Bethany was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your brother is sick. You have a cabin with a stove. A stove is not perfect, but it is a stove. What you are describing is a hole in a tree with a mat over the front. My stove has a cracked plate, and my cabin has 4 walls that leak. I burned through a week's worth of wood in 3 days during the last storm, and the room was still cold enough to see my breath. So fix the cabin." "With what?" "I need chinking compound, nails, and a stoveplate I cannot afford. The hollow needs tool, bark, and clay. I can carry tool, bark, and clay." Bethany picked up her basket. "I hope you are right," she said, "but I would not sleep in a stump with a child who is coughing blood." Mara watched her go. Bethany's objection was not stupid. It was the same objection Mara's own mind offered every time she looked at the dark opening in the redwood and tried to imagine trusting her brother's life to it. Mats mildew. Hollow trees hold damp. A stove, even a cracked stove, was built to heat a room. A burned stump was built by accident and fire. But the candle flame had not lied. The wind was the enemy, and the cabin could not stop it, and no amount of cordwood would matter if the heat left as fast as the fire made it. She cut more tool until her hands bled through her gloves, then carried the bundle up the ridge in the rain. The gossip reached Claude Beam's store before Mara's bundle reached the ridge. Beam kept the only general store between the ridge settlement and Orick. He sold flour, nails, salt, tobacco, kerosene, cordwood at $5 a cord, and credit at whatever rate suited him. He was 46, lean, careful with paper, and he had a ledger that half the ridge owed money into. Beam was not a timber baron. He was something quieter and in some ways more dangerous. a man who accumulated small debts against land that was worth more than the debts, and who waited for the weather or the loneliness or the sickness to force a signature. He had wanted the timber access on Mara's claim since Elias had filed. Elias alive was an obstacle. Elias dead was an opportunity. Beam was patient enough to let the opportunity ripen. The story came to him from a man named Deckard who had seen Mara hauling reeds up the trail. Deckard told it as a joke. Beam did not laugh. Beam listened, asked where the hollow was, and wrote something in the margin of his ledger. 2 days later, Beam rode up to the ridge. He brought a paper. He did not bring supplies. Mara was outside the hollow, scraping dried bark from a downed branch with the dull axe blade. The hollow entrance was partially cleared now. She had pulled out the loose debris and swept the floor with a bundle of fir boughs. Reed bundles leaned against the stump, drying badly in the wet air. Strips of bark and a bucket of gray clay sat near the opening. Beam dismounted and tied his horse to a young tan oak. He looked at the stump, the reed bundles, the bark strips, the clay. He looked at Mara's raw hands and muddy skirt. Then he walked to the hollow and ducked his head inside. "You're furnishing a stump," he said when he came out. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had already decided what he was seeing. "I am building a shelter. You have a cabin. The cabin does not hold heat." Beam brushed bark dust from his coat sleeve. "I have green cordwood at $5 a cord. I will deliver 2 cords tomorrow and add them to what Elias owed. I'm offering you a way to stay warm through January. And in January, when I cannot pay, we would discuss terms. Terms against the claim." Beam did not deny it. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I brought a simpler arrangement. Sign over the timber rights now. I will deliver the wood, clear the debt, and you can keep the cabin and the acreage. You lose the trees, not the land." Mara looked at the paper. She could see the blank line where her name would go. Beam had already written the terms above it. "The trees are what makes the land worth holding," Mara said. "Without timber rights, the claim is a mud patch on a ridge. A mud patch with a roof is better than a stump with a mat." Beam stepped toward the hollow. He reached inside and picked up one of the reed bundles Mara had started binding. He turned it over, then dropped it on the ground and pressed it flat with his boot. "Tule," he said. "Indians use it for mats. You're building an Indian mat house inside a burned tree, and you think this will keep you alive through a ridge winter. I think it will keep the wind out." Beam laughed. It was a short sound, more contempt than amusement. "You can sleep in a tree if you like. Come thaw. I will own the ground around it." He mounted his horse and rode down the trail. The paper stayed on the ground where he had set it, weighed down by a rock, the blank signature line facing up. Mara did not pick it up. She went back to the bark strips and kept working. But her hands were shaking, and it was not from the cold. Beam had seen the hollow. He knew where she was putting her effort. He knew she was not cutting wood, not buying credit, not doing the things a sensible widow did to survive. He would tell people. He would frame it in a way that made her sound unfit for the claim. And in a place where the Homestead Act required 5 years of continuous habitation and improvement, sounding unfit was halfway to losing everything. The rain picked up. Mara dragged the reed bundles inside the hollow and knelt on the dirt floor. The air was still. The charcoal smell was old and clean. Somewhere above her, the wind howled through the canopy, bending the tops of the living redwoods, but in here the sound was muffled and far away. She pressed her hand against the smooth wall and felt the same deliberate texture she had noticed the first time. Someone had scraped this surface. Someone had shaped this space, not nature, not fire alone. A person. The question sat in the dark with her. Who had been here first, and what had they known that Mara was only now beginning to understand? She started with the floor. The next morning, before light, Mara crawled into the hollow with the kitchen knife, a wooden spoon for digging, and a tin bucket. The floor was packed dirt mixed with old bark, charcoal fragments, and the soft mulch of decades. Moisture seeped up from below. If she slept on that floor, she would wake up wet, and wet and cold was death. She dug a shallow trench along the downhill side of the interior, angling it toward the entrance where it could drain outside. The work was slow. The ground was tangled with old roots that the knife could barely cut. Her knees ached from kneeling on the hard surface. Tobin tried to help, but his cough bent him double every few minutes, and she sent him back to the cabin with instructions to keep the stove fed and stay under the quilts. By midday, the trench was done. Shallow by maybe 4 inches deep and 6 inches wide, but enough to channel the worst of the seep water away from the center of the floor. She scraped the central area flat and packed it with the driest dirt she could find, then covered it with a layer of bark strips laid rough side down. The raised pallet came next. She needed a sleeping platform above the floor, high enough to keep bedding clear of any moisture the trench missed. She had no lumber, no nails, and no saw that worked. What she had was a ridge covered in fallen redwood. Redwood splits along the grain better than almost any wood on the coast. Mara found a section of fallen trunk that was sound enough to work and began splitting slabs with the axe and a wooden wedge she shaped from a branch. The axe was dull, but redwood forgave dull tools if you read the grain correctly. Her father had taught her that too. Not about redwood, but about Douglas fir on the docks. Wood tells you where it wants to break. You listen, or you waste your arms. 4 slabs, each about 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. She dragged them one at a time up the slope to the hollow, a distance of about 80 yards that felt like 800. Each slab weighed more than she wanted to calculate. Her shoulders burned. Her back seized on the third trip. She rested against the stump and looked at the sky, which was gray and heavy and promised more rain before evening. She stacked the slabs inside the hollow on cross pieces of branch, raising the sleeping surface about 8 inches off the floor. It was rough. It was uneven. Splinters stood up from every edge. But when she lay down on it, the floor moisture was below her, not soaking into her clothes. That was day 1. She had spent 9 hours on it. She had eaten nothing since morning because the walk back to the cabin for food meant losing daylight, and daylight was a currency she could not waste. When she finally crawled out of the hollow at dusk, her legs buckled. She sat in the ferns and breathed until the dizziness passed. Tobin had kept the stove going, but the cabin was barely warmer than the air outside. The cracked plate leaked smoke into the room, and the draft through the north wall made the fire pull sideways. Mara fed him beans and the last of a heel of bread. She checked his forehead, still hot. His cough was deeper now, rattling in his chest like something loose. She needed to get him warm and dry. The cabin could not do it. The hollow was not ready. The gap between the two was measured in days she might not have. Outside, the woodpile had dropped below a cord. She had been so focused on the hollow that she had not cut any new wood in 4 days. Every hour spent on the shelter was an hour not spent feeding the stove that kept Tobin alive tonight. The gamble cut both ways. Day 2 brought a setback. The axe handle, which had flexed all autumn, split along the grain while Mara was trimming a pallet support. The head flew off and buried itself in the mud. She stared at it for a long moment. A new handle required a straight piece of ash or hickory, neither of which grew on the ridge. The store in Orick had handles for 75 cents. 75 cents she did not have to spare. She improvised. She cut a green madrone branch, roughly the right diameter, stripped the bark, and wedged it into the axe eye. It held, barely. The green wood would shrink as it dried, which meant the head would loosen again within days. She had bought herself time, not a solution. The rain started that evening and did not stop for 3 days. Mara worked inside the hollow when she could, scraping the walls with the kitchen knife to remove loose char and expose the dense, fire-hardened wood beneath. The work revealed more of what she had felt in the dark. Tool marks. Regular, deliberate grooves where someone had used a blade, not a steel knife, something wider, something curved, to smooth the interior walls in a circular pattern. On the left side, about waist height, she found a shelf cut into the wood. Not a natural feature. A shelf, flat and level, wide enough to hold a jar or a bundle. Below the shelf, hidden under a mat of fallen bark that had wedged into a crack, she found a woven panel. Tule. Old, stiff, but not rotten. The cordage was plant fiber, tightly twisted, and the weave was denser than anything Mara could have made with her kitchen knife and bleeding hands. Someone had made this panel with skill and purpose and left it here. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the panel in the thin gray light that came through the entrance. The hollow was not a goose pen. It was not a bear den. It was not an accident. Someone had built this place. Someone had prepared it. The tool panel, the smoothed walls, the shelf. These were the marks of a person who had understood exactly what Mara was only beginning to figure out. Outside, the rain hammered the ferns flat. Tobin coughed in the cabin 80 yards away. The woodpile was shrinking. Beam's signature line waited on the ground where she had left it, the ink running in the wet. And inside the hollow, the air was still, the walls were dry, and the question that had followed Mara since the first night now had a sharper edge. Who had done this, and would what they built be enough to save what Mara could not save by herself? She did not know it yet, but the answer was walking toward her, and the answer knew her name. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could not see what you were building yet? The woman came on the 6th day, when Mara was down at the marsh cutting tule again. Mara had learned a few things about tule by now, mostly through failure. The first batch she had cut too green, and the reeds had curled as they dried, splitting along the edges and refusing to lie flat. The second batch she had cut at the wrong height, taking the thin upper stalks instead of the thick lower sections, and the result was mats so flimsy that wind pushed through them like cloth. She was on her 3rd attempt, knee-deep in cold water, sawing at the base of mature stalks with the kitchen knife, when a voice behind her said, "You are killing the bed." Mara turned. A woman stood on the bank watching her. She was perhaps 50, perhaps older. Her face was weathered in a way that made age hard to guess. She wore a wool blanket coat over a dark dress, and her hair was pulled back and tied with a strip of leather. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and a crooked knife in her right hand. She was Yurok, or part Yurok. Mara could tell from the way the other ridge settlers talked about the native families who still lived along the creek bottoms and in the old village sites near the coast. "The bed," the woman said again. She pointed at the water where Mara stood. "You are cutting below the growth line. Cut there. The roots die. No tool next year. No tool for anyone." Mara looked down at her knife. She had been cutting as low as she could to get the longest reeds. "Where should I cut?" The woman stepped to the edge of the bank. She pointed with the crooked knife. "Above the second joint. Here." She indicated a spot about 6 inches above the water line. "The root sends up new shoots from the joint below. You cut above, the plant lives. You cut below, you take the life out of the marsh for a basket of reeds." Mara moved her knife up. The cut was cleaner at this height. The stalk was firmer, less waterlogged. The woman watched her make 3 cuts, then nodded once. "What are you making?" the woman asked. "Mats. For a door." "A door to what?" Mara hesitated. "A hollow redwood, up on the ridge." Something changed in the woman's face. Not surprise. Recognition. She set her bag down on the bank and sat on a fallen log, as if the conversation had suddenly become worth her time. "Which hollow?" she asked. "The big stump above the second switchback, the one with the triangular opening." The woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Take me there." Her name was Martha Peters. She was 54 years old, a Yurok-Tolowa widow who lived in a plank house near the mouth of Redwood Creek with her daughter's family. She had been a weaver since girlhood, baskets, mats, fish traps, anything that could be made from plant fiber and patience. She walked the ridge trail without hurrying and without resting, and Mara, who was 20 years younger and had been working since dawn, struggled to keep pace. Martha said nothing on the walk. She studied the trail, the trees, the quality of the light through the canopy. When they reached the hollow, she stopped 10 feet from the entrance and looked at it the way a person looks at a house they once lived in. Then she ducked inside. Mara followed. The hollow was dim. Martha moved through the space with her hands, touching the walls, the shelf, the sleeping pallet Mara had built. She found the old tool panel and held it up to the gray light from the entrance. She ran her thumb along the cordage. "You found Rose's room," Martha said. "Rose?" "Rose Peters, my father's sister." Martha set the panel back on the shelf. "She built this place, not all at once, over years." "Why?" Martha sat on the pallet and looked at Mara in the half-dark. "Because there was a time when the trail between the village and the coast was not safe for a Yurok woman traveling alone. Settlers with guns. Men who did not think our women were people. Rose built places like this along the routes she walked, shelters where a person caught between the storm and the settlement could survive a night. Or 2 nights, or however long the danger lasted." The silence that followed was thick with things Mara understood without needing them explained. Rose had not built a curiosity. She had not built a home. She had built a mercy place, a room that existed because the world outside it was cruel enough to require one. "Is Rose alive?" Mara asked. "She died 11 years ago, up near the Klamath." Martha touched the smooth wall. "I have kept the room when I could, replaced mats, stocked dry fuel, but the walk is harder now, and the settlers do not like seeing me on the ridge. The fuel shelf is empty. I know I have not been up since spring." Martha looked at the pallet, the drainage trench, the bark strips on the floor. She looked at Mara's blistered hands, the cracked fingernails, the scratches on her arms from tule leaves. "You found this place and decided to use it." "I need it. My cabin will not hold heat. I do not have enough wood. My brother is sick." Martha nodded slowly. "Show me your mats." Mara brought out the tool bundle she had been working on, loose, uneven, the reeds tied with kitchen twine because she did not know how to make proper cordage. Martha took the bundle, turned it over, and set it on the ground without comment. The comment was in what she did next. She opened her canvas bag and pulled out a bundle of dried tulle that was nothing like Mara's. The reeds were uniform in thickness, split lengthwise and dried flat under weight, so they lay even as planks. Martha spread them on the pallet, overlapped them like shingles on a roof, and began binding them with twisted plant fiber that she produced from the bag in long, ready-made coils. "You overlap so the water sheds down," Martha said, her hands moving in a rhythm that looked easy and was not. "Like feathers on a duck. The top reed covers the join of the 2 below. Water hits the outside, runs down, never reaches the inside." Mara watched. In 10 minutes, Martha had assembled a mat section 2 feet wide and 3 feet long that was tighter, flatter, and more water resistant than anything Mara had produced in a week of cutting and cursing. I cannot do that, Mara said. Not yet. Martha handed her a coil of cordage. Sit. I will show you once. You will do it badly. Then I will show you again. Martha came back the next day, and the day after that. She did not announce that she was helping. She did not offer charity. She arrived at the hollow each morning with her bag and her crooked knife, and worked alongside Mara in a way that felt less like generosity and more like something she owed, not to Mara, but to the room itself and to the woman who had built it. The teachings came through action, not lecture. Martha did not explain principles. She showed Mara what to do, watched Mara fail, corrected the failure with her hands, and moved on. Tule cutting and curing. Cut above the second joint, split the mature stalks lengthwise with a thumbnail pressed into the pith, lay them under flat stones to dry for 2 days, weight them so they did not curl. Mara's first attempts curled anyway. Martha made her start over. The second batch was better. The third was usable. Smoke and spoilage. Martha opened the cedar bark packets on the high shelf, the ones Mara had not dared touch, and showed her what was inside. Dried fish, strips of smoked venison, acorn meal wrapped in bay leaves. Some of it was old, and Martha made Mara smell each packet before touching the contents. Rancid fat smells sharp, like metal that has been in the rain, Martha said. If you smell that, do not eat it. Hunger makes people foolish. Foolish kills faster than hunger. The food that was still good, Martha set aside. The food that had turned, she carried outside and buried. She told Mara that the cache had been stocked last spring by someone she did not say who, and that the person who stocked it had done a fair job with the fish, but had not dried the venison long enough. Oh, a cache is not a pantry, Martha said. A pantry feeds you every day. A cache keeps you alive when nothing else can. The food must be dried hard, smoked through, sealed against damp. If you stock it wrong, you stock a person's death. Ventilation. This was the lesson that frightened Mara the most. Martha made her light a handful of punky bark inside the hollow with the entrance mat closed. The smoke had nowhere to go. Within a minute, Mara's eyes burned and her lungs seized. Martha pulled her outside and waited until she stopped coughing. Now you know what happens when there is no draft, Martha said. She took the crooked knife and cut a hole in the upper wall of the hollow, about the size of Mara's fist, angling it upward through the soft outer bark into the open air above. Then she cleared a low gap at the base of the entrance, below where the mat door would hang. Air comes in low, warms, rises, goes out high, Martha said. The fire does not need much air, but it needs some or it makes poison. The vent is small because a big vent lets the wind back in. You balance, always balance. She made Mara light the punky bark again. This time the smoke curled upward, found the vent, and flowed out. The hollow filled with warmth instead of choking haze. Martha held a match near the low gap. The flame bent inward. Air was being drawn in from outside, feeding the fire gently, steadily. The system worked. Ethics of the cache. Martha told Mara the rule on the 4th day, while they hung the first proper mat door inside the entrance. Take what keeps life, she said. Replace before the next winter. Rose never locked this place. She never hid it. She built it for whoever needed it next. If you use it and do not restock it, you steal from a stranger you will never meet. Mara hung the second mat layer, leaving a hand-width gap between the two panels. The wind hit the outer mat and stalled. What seeped through met the inner mat and stalled again. Inside, the air was still. Martha held a candle between the mats. The flame barely trembled. Your father was a caulker, Martha said. It was not a question. Mara looked at her. How did you know that? Because you talk about wind the way a boat woman talks about water, leaks and seams. Your father taught you something, and you carried it up this ridge without knowing why. Mara did not answer. She hung the inner mat and tied it with cordage that Martha had shown her how to twist. The hollow was changing. It was no longer a burned stump with a cleared floor. It was becoming something deliberate, walled, baffled, vented, dry, with a sleeping platform 8 inches above the drainage trench and a shelf stocked with what food Martha had judged safe to keep. Day 10. The mat door hung in 2 layers. The clay threshold was set with flat river stones that Martha carried up from the creek bed, 4 trips down and 4 trips back, without complaint and without slowing. The drainage trench was working after the last rain. The center of the hollow was dry while the trench ran with brown water that flowed out under the threshold and into the slope. Day 12. The fuel shelf was stocked. 40 pounds of split alder that Mara had cut with the improvised axe handle, which was already loosening. 12 pounds of resinous pitchwood, not redwood, which had no pitch, but Douglas fir knots and pine slivers that Martha had gathered from a deadfall grove a mile south of the ridge. Bark tinder packed in a cedar box that Martha had brought from her own house. Mara counted the fuel. It was not 6 cords. It was not even half a cord. But the point was not volume. The point was that every piece was dry. Every piece was ready, and the hollow needed a fraction of what the cabin consumed because the hollow did not leak. Day 14. Tobin came to help. He twisted cordage under Martha's instruction, his thin fingers clumsy but willing. He lasted an hour before the coughing took him. Martha watched him bend double and press his face into his sleeve. She said nothing to Mara at the time. Later, on the trail back to the cabin, she said, "That boy needs to be warm and dry for a week straight. He needs broth and rest. The cabin will not give him that." The hollow is not ready. It is closer than you think. That night, Mara's axe handle cracked through. Not the improvised one. The original split had weakened the eye, and the makeshift madrone replacement finally sheared under a hard swing. The axe head dropped into the mud for the second time in 2 weeks. Mara stared at it in the failing light. She had no money for a new handle. She had no way to cut firewood without an axe. The crosscut saw was still broken. She sat on the chopping block and pressed her palms against her face. Her hands smelled like clay and charcoal and tool sap. Her back ached from a place below her ribs that never stopped aching anymore. She had not slept more than 4 hours in a night since Elias died, and the tiredness was not the kind that sleep fixed. It was the kind that lived in her bones and told her, in Orson Vale's voice, that this ridge was going to kill her. Tobin coughed inside the cabin. The sound was the only thing that made her stand up. The next morning, she found a bundle of old sailcloth beside the trail, folded and tied with hemp twine. No note. No name. She knew it was from Bethany Pike's oldest daughter, the girl who had watched Mara haul reeds and said nothing, the girl whose mother did not send it. Mara carried the sailcloth to the hollow. It was heavy canvas, sun-bleached and stiff, and it would serve as a 3rd layer behind the mat door, a wind barrier that tulle alone could not match. She hung it inside the entrance with cordage loops and stood back. The hollow had a floor with drainage, a raised pallet, 2 layers of tulle mat and 1 layer of sailcloth baffling the entrance, a thumb-width upper vent and a low draft gap, a shelf stocked with dry fuel and what food Martha had approved, smooth walls that held warmth the way a ship's hull holds water out, not by strength alone, but by the absence of gaps. It was not a cabin. It was not a home. It was the thing Martha had called it from the beginning, a mercy place. a room that existed because the world outside it made rooms like this necessary. Orson Vale came up the trail the following afternoon, riding the gray mule. He had heard from someone, Mara did not ask who, that the hollow was taking shape, and he had come to see for himself whether he needed to add Mara Belvoss to the list of people he would have to bury in the spring. He tied the mule and walked to the entrance. Mara pulled the mat door aside and let him in. Orson stood in the hollow and turned slowly. He touched the walls. He looked at the vent. He examined the mat layers and the sailcloth. He pressed the sleeping pallet and found it solid. He crouched beside the low draft gap and held his hand there, feeling the gentle pull of air. Then he stood and said, "This is clever work, but rain is not snow. A hard rain is 35 degrees. A whiteout is 20. I've seen both up here. That mat will not hold against snow packed by wind, and a sick child cannot survive a night in a tree trunk if the temperature drops below freezing." "The walls are a foot thick," Mara said. "Redwood does not conduct cold the way thin boards do. Martha says, Martha Peters is a weaver, not a builder." Orson said it without malice, but the dismissal was there. "I am not saying you have wasted your time. I am saying that what you have built may hold against what you have seen so far. It has not been tested against what is coming." He left without saying more, but at the entrance he paused and looked back at the candle Mara had set on the shelf to light the space. The flame stood straight, no tremor, no bend. The air inside the hollow was perfectly still. He noticed it. Mara saw him notice it. He said nothing, and he rode away. Potter. The test came 4 days later, uninvited and ahead of schedule. A Pacific storm moved onshore during the night, pushing warm rain ahead of it. By morning, the rain was heavy enough to flatten ferns and turn the trail into a running creek. Mara checked the cabin. Water dripped from 3 places in the roof. The mud floor was soft. The stove draft was pulling poorly because the rain had soaked the pipe cap and water ran down the inside of the flue. Tobin sat on the cot with a blanket over his head, coughing in bursts that sounded like something tearing. Mara made a decision. She wrapped Tobin in both quilts and the wool blanket, walked him through the rain to the hollow, and brought him inside. Martha was already there. She had come up the trail at first light, carrying a pot of acorn broth and a bundle of dry sedge grass for insulation. She said nothing about the decision. She helped Tobin onto the pallet and tucked the sedge grass around his legs. The 3 of them sat inside while the storm beat against the ridge. Outside, the wind pushed rain sideways through the canopy. Water cascaded off the redwood trunks in sheets. The sound was immense, a roar of water and wind that filled the forest. Inside, the mat door trembled. The outer layer darkened with moisture. The sailcloth behind it stayed dry. The inner mat stayed dry. A single candle burned upright on the shelf. The flame did not flicker. Martha lit the small ember pan, a flat stone lined with clay that Mara had made under her instruction. She set 3 wrist-thick alder sticks on a bed of pitch shavings and touched a match to the shavings. The flame caught, climbed, and held. Smoke curled upward, found the vent, and disappeared. The space warmed. After 1 hour, Martha checked the conditions. The threshold temperature where the draft came in was 48 degrees. The sleeping shelf, warmed by the ember pan and insulated by the thick walls, was 57 degrees. Fuel used: 2 handfuls of pitch shavings and 3 alder sticks. Mara had burned more fuel than that in 10 minutes trying to heat the cabin. Tobin stopped shivering. His cough did not stop, but the wet rattle in his chest eased. He slept for the first time in days without waking every hour to pull the blanket tighter. Martha looked at Mara across the small glow of the ember pan. "This is what Rose built it for," she said. not for comfort, for the night when comfort is the difference between living and not. The rain lasted 2 days. When it stopped, the hollow floor was dry. The mats needed retying at one corner where the wind had worked a binding loose, but the structure held. The fuel shelf had lost a quarter of its supply. They had burned carefully, feeding the ember pan in small measures, never letting the fire grow larger than a man's fist. But the storm was only rain. Orson was right about that. Rain tested the waterproofing. It tested the drainage. It tested the mat layers and the ventilation. What it did not test was the cold. Martha warned Mara before she left. This room is not a home. It is a last refuge. The danger is not using it. The danger is trusting it too late. When the real cold comes, you must already be inside. If you wait until you cannot reach it, the room means nothing. 3 days after the rain stopped, the mail rider Jonas Rell came up the trail with news. Roads south of Auric were washed out. A cold air mass was dropping over the inland ridges from the northeast. The coastal warmth that usually kept the ridge above freezing was being pushed out to sea. Rell had seen snow on the hills above the Trinity River, and the old-timers in Arcata were boarding windows. Mara asked Rell how long before the cold reached the ridge. 2 days, Rell said. Maybe 3. The wind has to swing, and when it swings, it will come fast. That evening, Beam's hired man, a heavy-shouldered drifter named Polk, who did whatever Beam paid him to do, came up the trail with a handcart. He went to Mara's outer shed, where she kept a small stack of pitchwood that Martha had helped her gather, and loaded it into the cart. Mara heard the cartwheels and came out of the cabin. "What are you doing?" Polk did not look at her. "Mr. Beam says this fuel is against what is owed. He is collecting." "That wood is mine. I gathered it." "Mr. Beam says the shed sits on credit-secured ground. Everything in the shed is collateral." Mara stepped toward the cart. Polk was twice her weight and had arms built for hauling. She stopped. The pitchwood in the cart was maybe 15 pounds, a small amount, but it was the dry, resinous fuel that started fires fast when fingers were too numb to coax a flame. Without it, every fire she lit would take longer to catch, burn longer to warm, waste more of the alder and fir she could not replace. Polk pushed the cart down the trail. Mara watched the pitchwood go and felt the margin between survival and failure shrink by another measure. She went to the hollow and counted what was left on the shelf. 40 pounds of alder, 8 pounds of pitchwood, the stock inside the hollow that Polk had not known about or had not been told to take. Bark tinder, the cedar box with matches, the food Martha had approved, dried fish, acorn meal, smoked venison strips sealed in bay leaves. It was enough for one long night, maybe 2 if she rationed the fuel down to embers and body heat. It was not enough for a week. It was not enough for the kind of storm Jonas Rell was describing. Mara stood in the hollow and listened to the wind outside. It was coming from the southwest, still the warm Pacific wind, still pushing rain. But somewhere over the mountains, the cold air was massing, waiting for the wind to shift. When it shifted, everything would change. She had a refuge, but the margin had been cut. Beam had seen to that. The question was no longer whether the hollow would work. The question was whether Mara could reach it when the worst arrived, and whether what remained on the shelf would be enough to outlast what was coming. The wind shifted at 3 a.m. Mara woke because the cabin went silent. The rain had been drumming on the shakes for hours, the constant, heavy percussion of a coastal storm that you stopped hearing after a while because it never stopped. And then it stopped. The silence was louder than the rain. She lay still and listened. The stove ticked as it cooled. The draft through the north wall, which had been a wet whistle all night, changed to something drier and sharper. The temperature in the cabin dropped. not gradually. It fell like a step off a ledge. Mara got up and opened the door. The rain was gone. In its place, the air was thick with something that was not quite rain and not quite snow, a wet, heavy whiteness that came sideways out of the northeast. The wind had swung. The warm Pacific current that kept the coast mild had been pushed out, and the inland cold had poured over the mountains and down the ridges like water filling a ditch. Snow. Not the soft, dry snow of high elevation. Wet snow. Ridge snow. The kind that soaks everything it touches, freezes in layers, and turns a forest into a maze of white that erases trails and landmarks and any sense of direction. Mara closed the door. Tobin was awake, sitting up on the cot, his blanket pulled to his chin. His breath was visible. The stove fire had died to gray ash while they slept, and the firebox was cold. She went to the woodpile. The alder stacked against the cabin wall was glazed with ice. She grabbed a piece and brought it inside. It was wet through, the bark slick, the wood cold enough that her fingers stuck to it. She opened the stove and tried to build a fire. The kindling was damp. The first match guttered. The second caught the edge of a bark strip, burned for 10 seconds, and went out when smoke backed down the flue. The draft was dead. The wind outside was pressing against the stovepipe from above, pushing smoke back into the room. The third match lit the bark strip, and the bark strip lit a sliver of pitchwood, the last dry piece she had in the cabin. The sliver caught, and for a moment the stove drew. Then the wind gusted, the flue choked, and smoke poured into the room like gray water filling a bowl. Tobin started coughing. Mara's eyes streamed. She shut the stove door and opened the cabin door to clear the air, and the cold hit them like a hand. The cabin was not going to work. The stove could not draw. The wood was wet. The walls leaked. The floor was sweating. The temperature was dropping, and every minute they stayed was a minute of burning fuel they did not have for heat they could not keep. Mara made the decision in the time it took to close the door. She told Tobin to put on every piece of clothing he owned. She wrapped him in both quilts. She pulled on her coat and her shawl and her boots and tied the laces with fingers that were already stiff. The hollow was 80 yards up the slope. In clear weather, it was a 2-minute walk. In this wet snow driving sideways, wind erasing the footpath, visibility down to the length of her arm, it could be the distance between alive and dead. She took the lantern. She took the last candle. She put her arm around Tobin and opened the door. The snow hit them immediately. It was not falling. It was flying, horizontal, heavy, and so thick that Mara could not see the woodpile 5 feet from the door. The wind was a physical force, pushing against her chest, finding every gap in her coat, pulling heat from her body with a speed that felt deliberate, malicious. They made it 10 steps before Tobin stumbled. His foot caught a root hidden under the snow, and he went down hard. Mara hauled him up. His cough exploded, a deep convulsive seizure that bent him double. She held him until it passed, the snow accumulating on their shoulders and in the folds of the quilts. 15 steps. 20. Mara aimed for the dark bulk of the redwood trunks that she knew stood between the cabin and the hollow. If she could find the first trunk, she could move from tree to tree. The redwoods were her landmarks, the only things on the ridge that the snow could not bury or erase. She found the first trunk by walking into it. Her outstretched hand hit bark, and the impact jolted through her wrist. She pressed her back against the tree and pulled Tobin close. The wind split around the trunk. For a moment, on the lee side, the snow fell straight down instead of sideways, and Mara could see 5 feet ahead. The second trunk was there. She moved to it. The third. The fourth. A branch broke somewhere above them, a sound like a gunshot in the roar of wind. Something heavy crashed through the canopy and hit the ground to their left. Mara felt the impact through the soles of her boots. Tobin cried out. She pulled him past the fallen limb and kept moving. The lantern died. The wind found the flame through the glass and snuffed it. Mara dropped the useless thing and kept one hand on Tobin and one hand on the trees. She could not see the hollow. She could not see anything. The snow was total, a white blindness that erased up and down and near and far. She was navigating by touch and memory, counting trunks the way a blind woman counts steps. 3 trunks past the big fir with the scar, 2 more past the rock that jutted from the slope. Then the ground should rise, and the stump should be. She saw it because the snow did not stick inside the charred opening. The triangular mouth of the hollow was a black shape in the white, a void where the driving snow simply vanished. The charred wood inside was too warm for the wet flakes to hold. They melted on contact with the fire-hardened surface. Mara pushed Tobin through the opening and crawled in after him. The silence was immediate. Not true silence. The wind roared outside, and snow hissed against the outer bark, but inside, the air did not move. The mat door hung in its place. The sailcloth behind it was still. The temperature inside was cold, but it was a still cold, not the cutting, moving cold of the wind outside. Mara's hands found the shelf. She found the cedar box. She struck a match. The flame lit the hollow, and for the first time Mara saw the full extent of what Rose Peters had built and Martha Peters had maintained. The smooth walls curved upward into darkness. The carved smoke shelf near the vent directed airflow along the ceiling. The tool mats rolled tight on the upper shelf were backup panels, ready to replace any that failed. The pitchwood was stacked on the left, bark side out. The dry alder was on the right, split to wrist thickness for slow burning. The food packets, cedar bark wrapped, bay leaf sealed, sat on the highest shelf, above any moisture that might creep up from the floor. It was not a miracle. It was a system. Every piece placed where it was for a reason. Every material chosen for a property. The pitchwood for quick heat. The alder for slow, steady burn. The mats for wind. The vent for smoke. The shelf height for moisture. The walls for insulation. Rose Peters had not left a gift. She had left an engineering solution, built from tule and redwood, and the understanding that the enemy was not the cold itself, but the cold's ability to move. Mara followed Martha's teaching. She opened the low draft gap by pulling the bottom edge of the inner mat aside 1 hand width. She checked the upper vent, clear, not blocked by snow. She shaved pitchwood curls no larger than her thumb and set them on the ember pan. She struck a second match, and the shavings caught. The flame was small and orange, and it threw shadows up the curved walls like the inside of a lantern. She fed dry alder slowly, 1 stick, then another. She checked the smoke by holding the match flame near the vent. The smoke climbed and exited. The air was clean, the space warmed. Her frozen skirt steamed. Her fingers burned as blood returned. Tobin stopped shaking and pressed himself against the pallet, pulling the quilts over his head. His cough continued, but it was the persistent cough of illness, not the desperate gasping of a body losing its core heat. They were alive. They were warm. And Mara's injured shoulder, the limb that had struck her on the walk, throbbed with a pain that told her she had been closer to failing than she wanted to admit. But alive was not safe. Tobin was in the hollow. Tobin was warming. Tobin was not the only person on the ridge. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the choice she makes now changes everything. Mara sat in the glow of the ember pan and listened. Outside, the wind screamed through the canopy. Snow drove against the stump in waves that she could feel as vibrations through the thick walls. Somewhere down the ridge, her cabin was filling with smoke from a stove that could not draw. Somewhere farther down, Bethany Pike's children were in a house with a chimney that clogged in hard wind. Somewhere on the road, a man or a horse or a wagon was caught between shelters with no way to see the next tree, and in the cabin, the stove was dead. The fire was out. The door was open because Mara had not closed it when they left. Snow was blowing in through the gap, covering the floor, the cot, the cold stove. Everything Mara owned that she had not carried to the hollow was getting wet. She could stay. The hollow was warm. The fuel would last the night if she rationed. Tobin needed rest. Leaving meant going back into the whiteout, back into the wind that stole heat and the snow that erased direction. But leaving also meant she could close the cabin door before everything inside was ruined. It meant she could check the trail for anyone caught in the open. It meant she could do what Rose Peters had built this place to make possible: survive, and then help someone else survive. She told Tobin to feed the fire one stick at a time and not to open the mat door. She tied a length of tulle cordage to the stump outside the entrance. Martha had taught her to always leave a line, and crawled out into the white. The cold hit her like a wall collapsing. She gasped, and the wind filled her mouth with snow. She grabbed the cordage and paid it out as she moved, marking her return path. Visibility was 0. She moved by feel, tree to tree, counting trunks. She reached the cabin. The door was open, as she had feared. Snow covered the floor an inch deep. She closed the door, dragged a quilt off the cot, and stuffed it against the base where the gap let the wind in. The stove was dead and would stay dead until the wind dropped. She took the last of the dry kindling from the box beside the stove, a double handful of bark strips, and put them in her coat. Outside again. She followed the cordage back toward the hollow, fighting the wind with every step. Halfway there, she heard something. A voice, or the wind, or a branch. She stopped and listened. It came again, not a voice. A cough, thin, high, whipped away by the wind almost before it reached her. It was not Tobin's cough. Tobin was in the hollow. This was coming from the trail below. Mara tied her end of the cordage to the nearest trunk and moved toward the sound. She found Orson Vale 20 yards down the slope, on his hands and knees in the snow. The mule was gone, bolted probably, when a branch fell. Orson had been coming up the trail with a rope line, trying to reach Mara's cabin after seeing the stove smoke die from his window down the ridge. He had made it 2/3 of the way before the snow erased the trail and the cold took his sense of direction. "Mara," he said when she knelt beside him. His lips were blue. His hands were bare. He had lost his gloves somewhere on the trail. "Your smoke stopped." "I know. Come with me." She got him upright. He leaned on her, and she felt his weight, a big man, even at 61, and half frozen. She could not carry him. She could barely guide him. But she had the cordage, and the cordage led to the hollow, and the hollow was warm. They reached it. She pushed Orson through the entrance. Tobin was still feeding the fire, one stick at a time, his face orange in the glow. Orson collapsed on the floor beside the pallet and did not speak for several minutes. His hands shook as blood returned to them. Mara checked the fuel. 30 pounds of alder left, 6 pounds of pitchwood. The food was untouched. The ember pan was burning cleanly. The temperature on the sleeping shelf was 61 degrees. Outside, the wind was driving snow against the stump, hard enough to hear the impacts like sand thrown against a drum. She had 3 people in a space built for 1 or 2. She had fuel for the night, but not for 2 nights. She had an injured shoulder, a sick brother, and a half-frozen man who had come to save her and needed saving himself. But the hollow held. The walls did not leak. The mats did not fail. The vent drew smoke, and the draft fed air, and the fire burned small and steady, and the world outside could scream all it wanted, Rose Peters had built a mercy place. Martha Peters had kept it ready. Maribel Voss was learning what mercy cost. Near dawn, a sound at the entrance. Mara pulled the mat aside and found Martha Peters on her knees in the snow, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Behind her, barely visible in the gray pre-dawn light, was Bethany Pike's youngest child, a girl of 4, wheezing and crying. Martha had found the child on the trail. Bethany's chimney had clogged with snow-packed soot, and the house had filled with smoke. Bethany had sent the older children to the root cellar and carried the youngest toward the road, hoping to reach a neighbor. The child had been left wrapped in a blanket near a tree when Bethany went back for the others. Martha had found her there, half covered in snow, still breathing. 5 people now: Mara, Tobin, Orson, Martha, and a 4-year-old girl who could not stop crying. The ember pan burned, the mats held. The fuel shelf emptied 1 stick at a time. Outside, the ridge lay buried in white. The cabin Mara had built her claim on was cold and dark and full of snow. The 6 cords Orson had said she needed were somewhere under the ice, and she did not have them, and it did not matter. She had something else. She had a room where the wind could not follow, built by a woman she had never met, maintained by a woman who had walked through a whiteout to reach it, and stocked with fuel that burned slowly because the walls around it held the heat, instead of letting the cold steal it away. Orson sat against the wall, his hands wrapped in strips of tulle that Martha had soaked in warm water. He looked at the flame burning upright on the ember pan. He looked at the mat door that did not move. He looked at Mara, who was feeding the fire 1 stick at a time with the precision of a woman who had counted every piece of wood and knew exactly what each one was worth. He did not say anything, not yet. That would come later, in the gray morning, when the wind dropped and the world came back. For now he watched the flame and understood something that he had not been willing to count, that warmth was not only made by fuel, it was kept by stillness, and Mara had found the stillest room on the ridge. The morning came, the wind eased, the snow stopped, the hollow had held. The question now was not whether Mara would survive the winter. The question was what the winter had made of her, and what it would make of the ridge that had laughed when she crawled into a burned tree with a bundle of tulle mats. Orson Vale stepped out of the hollow at first light and stood in the snow that covered the ridge trail to the depth of his shins. The sky was gray and still. The wind had dropped to nothing. The trees held snow on every branch, and the silence after the storm was so complete that the sound of his own breathing seemed too loud for the morning. He looked down the slope toward Mara's cabin. The roof was white. The door was shut. Mara had closed it during the storm. Smoke did not rise from the stovepipe. The woodpile beside the wall was buried. From where Orson stood, the cabin looked like something that had been abandoned for a season, not a night. He turned back to the hollow. Mara was inside, feeding the last of the alder to the ember pan. Tobin was asleep on the pallet. Martha was wrapping Bethany's daughter in dry tulle matting, the child finally quiet after crying through most of the dark hours. The air inside was warm enough that Orson had loosened his coat before he left. His hands, wrapped in the tulle strips Martha had soaked in heated water, were sore but working. Mara came out to stand beside him. Her shoulder was stiff where the branch had struck it, and she held her right arm close to her body. Her face was drawn. She had not slept. Orson looked at the buried trail, then at the hollow entrance, then at Mara. "I counted cords," he said. "You counted what the wind could steal." He paused. The words came hard for a man who had given verdicts for 30 years and rarely changed them. "I was wrong." Mara did not answer immediately. She watched the snow drip from a fern frond where the weak sun was already working on the south-facing slope. Then she said, "You were not wrong about the math. 6 cords would have kept the cabin warm, but I did not have 6 cords. I had to solve a different problem. You solved it. Rose Peters solved it. Martha Peters kept it ready. I crawled into it." Orson shook his head. "You did more than crawl. You baffled the entrance. You built the pallet. You cut and stacked the fuel. You dragged your brother through a whiteout to reach it. That was not crawling. That was building something I did not have the wit to recognize." He untied his mule, which someone, Martha probably, had sheltered behind the stump's leeward bulk during the storm. The animal was cold and unhappy but alive. Orson mounted and looked down at Mara. "I will tell people what I saw," he said. "Not because you asked, because they need to know what works." He rode down the trail, the mule picking through snow that was already softening in the coastal air. By afternoon, the ridge would be mud again. But the night had changed something that mud could not change back. Bethany Pike came up the trail before noon, carrying a kettle of broth in her gilt. She had sent her youngest daughter toward the road in the whiteout. She had meant to follow. The smoke in her house had been so thick that she could not see the door, and by the time she got the older children to the root cellar and came back, the child was gone. Martha had found her. Bethany had spent the rest of the night in the root cellar, not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead. She stood at the entrance of the hollow and did not go in until Martha, who was inside re-rolling mats, looked up and nodded. It was a small gesture. It carried the weight of permission that Bethany understood she needed, and Mara did not have the authority to give. This place belonged to someone older than both of them. Bethany set the kettle on the threshold and looked at the interior. The ember pan, the mat door, damp on the outside and dry on the inner face. The sleeping pallet where her daughter had been warm while Bethany had been in a root cellar with 2 frightened children and no fire. She touched the inner mat. She pressed it between her fingers and felt the layered tulle, the tight cordage, the overlap pattern that shed water like feathers. She looked at the vent hole in the upper wall and the low draft gap at the base of the entrance. "Show me how to hang one of these in my smokehouse," Bethany said. It was not an apology. It was better than an apology. It was the admission that the things she had dismissed as foolish had kept her child alive while her own house had failed. Mara showed her. They spent the afternoon at Bethany's property, hanging a tool baffle inside the smokehouse door where Bethany stored her cured meat and dried fish. The smokehouse had the same problem as every structure on the ridge. Wind found the gaps and stole the heat and made the draft unpredictable. Mara showed Bethany the candle test. Hold a flame near every seam and watch where it bends. Then seal the bends with clay, bark strips, or matting. Bethany's smokehouse, baffled and sealed, held an evening fire with half the fuel it had needed the week before. Bethany stood inside and felt the air sit still around her, and she understood. The questions came over the following days, one family at a time. A man named Deckard, the same man who had told Beam about the tool bundles and laughed, came to the hollow with his hat in his hands and asked Mara how thick a mat door needed to be to stop the wind in a lean-to. Mara told him 2 layers with a gap between them, and she showed him the overlap pattern on the tule. A woman named Parrish, whose husband had frostbitten 3 fingers during the storm, asked whether a cellar could be baffled the same way. Mara said yes, if the cellar had a vent cut above and a draft gap below, and if the mats were hung inside the door frame, not outside where rain would soak them. Orson brought 3 men from the lower ridge to see the hollow. He did not ask Mara's permission because the hollow was not Mara's. It was no one's. That was the point. Martha stood by while the men examined the walls, the vent, the mat door. She answered their questions about tool curing and cordage strength. She did not answer their questions about who had built the hollow or why. That story was not theirs to hear on a first visit. Mara set one rule, and it was Martha's rule. Every family who learned the method had to help stock one public cache before improving their own property. The knowledge was free. The obligation was not. Measurable results came quickly. Bethany's smokehouse, baffled with tool mats and sealed at the gaps, used half the fuel it had consumed before. Orson's shed corner, baffled with sailcloth and a tool panel, kept stored kindling dry through 2 heavy rains that followed the snowstorm. Deckard's lean-to, chinked with clay and fitted with a 2-layer mat door, held its stove heat long enough that his wife could bank the fire at night instead of feeding it every 2 hours. Mara's own cabin, after she spent 3 days chinking the walls and hanging matting inside the door and window frames, held an evening fire twice as long as before. The numbers were simple and repeatable. The people who sealed their gaps and baffled their doors burned less wood. The people who burned less wood had more wood left. The people who had more wood left lived closer to the margin of safety that Orson had once calculated at 6 cords and now admitted could be reached at 4 if the structure was tight enough. But the numbers were also a threat. And Claude Beam understood threats the way he understood debt, as opportunities. Beam came to the hollow 10 days after the storm. He did not come alone. He brought Polk, the hired man who had taken Mara's pitchwood, and he brought a paper. Beam always brought a paper. Mara was inside the hollow with Martha, restacking the fuel shelf with wood she had split over the previous 3 days. The improvised axe handle was holding, barely, and every swing reminded her that it could fail at any moment. Her shoulder still ached from the falling branch. She had not been to a doctor because there was no doctor on the ridge, and the nearest one in Orick charged $2 for a visit she could not afford. Beam stood at the entrance and did not duck inside. He looked at the hollow from outside, the way a man looks at a property he is assessing for purchase. "I want to make you an offer," he said. Mara set down the wood she was carrying. "I am not signing anything, Claude. This is not about your claim. This is about the stump." He gestured at the hollow. "People are talking about it. Orson is bringing men up here to see it. You have turned a burned tree into an attraction, and attractions on the ridge sit on timberland, and timberland falls under access agreements that I hold." Martha stepped to the entrance. She was smaller than Beam and 30 years older, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a dog that has wandered into a house where it does not belong. "This place is not on your timber access," Martha said. "It sits on public land above the claim boundary. The trail to it crosses claim land. People have walked this ridge for 1,000 years without your permission." Beam's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight and tried a different approach. "I am not trying to close it. I am trying to protect it. If this thing is valuable, it should be secured. I can put a lock on the door, stock it with proper supplies, and manage access for the benefit of the community." Martha said, "A mercy place with a lock is not a mercy place." The line landed in the silence between them like a stone in still water. Beam looked at Martha. Martha looked at Beam. Neither moved. Beam turned to Mara. "You think she speaks for this ridge? She is a guest on land her people lost. The men who make decisions here buy at my store and owe into my ledger. I'm offering to help. If you refuse my help, I will find other ways to be involved." He left. Polk followed. The paper stayed in Beam's coat. Martha sat on the pallet and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He will not stop." "I know. He does not want the room. He wants what the room gives the people who use it. If they do not need his wood, they do not need his credit. If they do not need his credit, he cannot buy their claims. Mara understood. The hollow had done more than save 5 people during a storm. It had shown the ridge that Beam's cordwood was not the only path to warmth, and a man whose power depended on being the only path would work to close every other one. The weeks after the storm were the deepest part of Mara's education, and they came not through crisis but through work done beside a woman who treated every task as if it carried the weight of the people who would depend on its result. Martha came to the ridge most days. Some mornings she arrived with materials, cured tulle, cordage coils, cedar bark sheets. Other mornings she arrived with nothing but her crooked knife and her knowledge and her patience for a young woman who was learning faster than she made mistakes, but still made plenty. They built together, small redwood storage boxes with raised feet to keep contents above any floor moisture. Double tulle curtains for Bethany's smokehouse and for the root cellar where Bethany had sheltered her children during the storm. Clay-lined ember pans with 3 flat stones for feet, replacing the crude flat stone version Mara had made in the first days. Notched markers, 1 notch for fuel, 2 for food, 3 for shelter, that could be carved into trees near cache locations without advertising what was stored. Martha kept a ledger, not Beam's kind of ledger, full of debts and interest. A ledger of what had been taken from the cache and what had been replaced. Orson had taken fuel during the storm. He replaced it with 3 armloads of seasoned fir the following week. Bethany had used food. She replaced it with dried fish and a sack of acorn meal that Martha showed her how to prepare. Deckard, who had laughed, brought 2 bundles of pitchwood knots and said nothing while he stacked them on the shelf. The ledger was the law of the cache made visible. Take what keeps life, replace what keeps another. Martha wrote the entries in a hand that was careful and slow, and she kept the ledger in her canvas bag, not in the hollow, because the ledger belonged to the keeper, not the place. The teaching spread outward. Mara showed Bethany how to test drafts with a candle, the way her father had shown her with a lantern. Hold the flame near every seam in the house and watch where it bends. Wherever it bends, the wind is entering, and wherever the wind enters, heat leaves. Bethany walked her entire house with a candle stub and found 11 leaks she had never noticed. She sealed them with clay and bark and cut her firewood use by 1/3 in a week. Martha taught the children. She took Bethany's oldest girl and the Deckard boy down to the marsh and showed them how to split tulle without killing the root bed. Cut above the second joint, always above. She made them repeat the rule until they could say it without thinking, because a rule that requires thinking is a rule that gets forgotten when the hands are cold and the need is urgent. The children asked why the tulle had to live, and Martha told them that the marsh was not a store with unlimited stock. It was a living place that gave freely, but could not give what it did not have. Orson contributed in his own way. He gathered 3 men and showed them how to cut a drainage trench around a hollow redwood without weakening the root structure. You dig on the downhill side, he told them, never uphill, never around the whole base. You open a channel for the water to leave, and you leave the roots their grip. It was the kind of practical knowledge that Orson had carried for decades without attaching it to anything as specific as what Mara was building. Now it had a purpose, and the purpose made the knowledge feel different in his mouth. Not a warning, but a contribution. Mara taught a lesson of her own at a gathering one evening at Bethany's house. Separate your fuel. Tinder in one place, dry and covered. Kindling in another, split thin and stacked where air can reach it. Fuel wood in a third, seasoned and off the ground. The Ridge families had been piling everything together under lean-tos where rain soaked the kindling and the tinder rotted against the green logs. Separating the fuel by type and keeping each grade dry meant that a fire could be started in minutes instead of the 20 or 30 it took to coax wet wood into a flame. It was after one of these teaching days, while Mara and Martha walked back to the hollow in the last light, that Martha told her about Rose. Not the facts. Mara already knew the facts. Martha told her the rest. How Rose had been a girl during the worst of the settlement violence, when families were driven off ancestral land and scattered into the hills. How Rose had watched her mother weave through grief, making mats and baskets because the hands needed work even when the heart had stopped. How Rose had built the first mercy place not from wisdom, but from anger. Anger that the world forced people to need hiding places, and determination that the hiding places would exist whether the world approved or not. She was not gentle about it, Martha said. People remember her as kind. She was not kind. She was furious. She built the rooms because she was too angry to accept that people should freeze when the forest was full of shelter that no one had thought to prepare. Mara said nothing. She understood the feeling. She had crawled into Rose's room not from courage, but from the kind of desperation that burns away everything except the next task. Anger and necessity looked the same from the inside. It was during the building of the second cache that Mara and Martha had their first real disagreement. The second cache was Martha's idea. A hollow redwood near Prairie Creek Crossing, smaller than Rose's room but sound, with walls thick enough to insulate and a natural overhang that shed rain. The location mattered because the crossing was where the ridge trail met the creek road, and travelers caught between settlements, often sheltered there in bad weather with no protection but the trees. Martha wanted to build it exactly as Rose had built the first. Tool mats, bark seals, carved shelves, a vent cut with a crooked knife. Mara wanted to add improvements. A hinged door frame instead of hanging mats. A stone-lined fire pit instead of a clay ember pan. Metal brackets for the shelves if she could find or trade for them. The mats work, Martha said. They were standing inside the second hollow, arguing in the dim light while rain fell outside. Rose tested them for years. They shed water. They block wind. They can be replaced from materials anyone can gather. A hinged door needs hardware. Hardware needs money. Money needs beam. A hinged door would be stronger in heavy wind. The mats at Rose's room almost failed during the whiteout. The outer layer was soaked through. Almost failed is not failed, and a soaked mat dries in one day. A broken hinge stays broken until someone rides to Auric. Mara pressed. The ember pan cracked during the storm. Clay is not strong enough for repeated heating. A stone-lined pit would last. A stone-lined pit weighs more than you can carry. An ember pan weighs nothing. If it cracks, you make another. The whole point of Rose's design is that it can be built and rebuilt by anyone with hands and patience. The moment you need tools that not everyone has, you have built something that belongs to the people who have the tools. The argument was not about doors and fire pits. It was about philosophy. Martha believed that survival knowledge must be built from materials that grew in the ground and could be gathered by anyone. Mara believed that improvement was not ownership, that better tools did not have to mean restricted access. They were both right, and neither would yield. They compromised. The second cache used tule mats for the door, as Martha wanted, but Mara reinforced the hanging system with a frame of split redwood pegged together with hardwood dowels. No metal, no hardware, but sturdier than cordage alone. The ember pan was clay, as Martha insisted, but Mara shaped it thicker at the base and fired it in Bethany's smokehouse to harden it beyond what air drying could achieve. Martha watched the firing and said nothing. When the pan came out of the smoke without cracking, she picked it up, turned it in her hands, and said, "Your father taught you about seams. You taught yourself about fire." It was the closest Martha came to praise. Martha's cough started in late autumn. Not Tobin's cough. Tobin was improving slowly as the baffled cabin held warmth and his body finally had the dry rest it needed to fight. Martha's cough was different. Dry at first, then wet. then streaked with something dark that she wiped from her mouth with a cloth she kept in her bag and did not show Mara. Mara noticed anyway. She noticed the mornings when Martha arrived later than usual. She noticed the rest stops on the trail that had not been there before. She noticed that Martha carried her bag on her left shoulder now instead of her right, as if the right side hurt. She did not ask. Martha was not the kind of woman who welcomed questions about her body, but Mara watched, and the watching became its own kind of dread, quieter than the storm, slower than the cold, but just as certain in its direction. They finished the second cache in early November, a year after Mara had first crawled into Rose's hollow with bleeding hands and no idea what she was touching. The second cache was smaller, but tighter. Mats hung true, vent cut clean, fuel shelf stocked with alder and pitchwood that 6 families had contributed, food sealed in cedar bark, the notched markers carved into trees along the trail, 3 notches, then 2, then 1, leading travelers to the entrance without words. Martha stood outside the finished cache and looked at it for a long time. The rain was light. Her coat was wet. She leaned on a walking stick she had started carrying 2 weeks earlier. Rose's room was never meant to be the only one, she said. A thing that saves one person is a memory. A thing that saves strangers is a law, whether men write it down or not. Mara heard the sentence as instruction. She also heard it as farewell. Martha was not leaving, not yet, but she was speaking the way people speak when they are placing things where others can find them after they are gone. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks later, on a morning when the rain turned to sleet, and the temperature dropped fast enough that the mud on the ridge trail froze into ridges that cut through boot leather. A wagon carrying a family named Quayle had been moving south along the creek road toward Orick. The husband, Walter Quayle, was driving. His wife Lydia was 7 months pregnant and riding in the back on a mattress of folded blankets. Their 2 older children walked alongside. The wagon hit a frozen rut. The front axle cracked, and the whole rig tilted into the ditch beside the road. Walter unhitched the horse and rode for help. He told Lydia to wait in the wagon, but the sleet was turning to freezing rain, and the wagon bed had no cover, and the blankets were soaked within an hour. Lydia gathered the children and walked toward the only shelter she could see, a stand of redwoods where the canopy blocked the worst of the ice. The Quayle children were 7 and 5. They were cold, frightened, and had no idea where they were. Lydia was having contractions, not the mild tightening she had felt for weeks, real contractions, sharp and rhythmic, the kind that meant the baby was not waiting for a warm room and a midwife. Orson found them. He had been riding the ridge, checking on families after the sleet started, and he saw the broken wagon from the trail above. He followed the tracks into the trees and found Lydia sitting against a redwood trunk with her arms around her children, her face white, her breath coming in short bursts that had nothing to do with the cold. "How far apart?" Orson asked. "Close," Lydia said. "Too close." Orson looked at the sky. The sleet was thickening. The nearest house was Bethany's, 40 minutes down the ridge in conditions that a pregnant woman could not walk. The nearest settlement was an hour by horse, and the horse was gone with Walter Quayle. But the second cache was 12 minutes away, the one near Prairie Creek Crossing, the one Mara and Martha had finished 3 weeks earlier. Orson had helped stock it. He knew where the notched markers were. He gathered the Quayle children, helped Lydia onto the mule, and led them through the sleet toward the 3-notched tree. He sent one of the ridge boys running for Mara. Mara arrived at the second cache with an armload of dry tule and the ember pan she had fired in Bethany's smokehouse. Martha was too ill to come. She had been in bed for 2 days with the cough that was no longer a cough, but something deeper and harder. Mara had sat with her that morning and asked if she needed anything. Martha had said, "Go. Do what I showed you. The room is ready. Mara crawled into the second hollow and found Orson, Lydia, and the two children huddled against the back wall. The mats were hung. The fuel shelf was stocked. But no one had lit a fire because Orson's hands were shaking too badly to strike a match, and Lydia could not uncurl from the position the contractions had forced her into. Mara lit the fire. She opened the low draft. She cleared the upper vent. She shaved pitchwood curls onto the ember pan and struck a match. The shavings caught. She fed alder, one stick at a time. The smoke rose, found the vent, exited. The hollow warmed. She had done this before. She had done it in the dark, in a whiteout, with a sick brother and a half-frozen man and a crying child. But this time Martha was not beside her. This time the teachings were in Mara's hands alone, and the hands were steady because they had practiced every step until the steps were memory. Bethany arrived 20 minutes later, carrying hot water in a kettle she had wrapped in quilts to keep warm on the trail. She ducked into the hollow and looked at Lydia and said, "How long?" "Soon," Mara said. The baby was born before dawn, a girl, small, early, but breathing. Mara held the child while Bethany helped Lydia, and Orson kept the children quiet in the corner with a strip of dried venison from the cache shelf. The ember pan held. The mats held. The vent drew clean. The fuel lasted through the night with enough left on the shelf that Mara could keep a low fire burning through the morning until Walter Quayle arrived on a borrowed horse with a blanket and the kind of stunned expression that men wear when they leave for an hour and come back to find the world has changed. Lydia named the girl Rose. She did not know about Rose Peters. She did not know the hollow she lay in had been inspired by a Yurok woman who had built mercy places along dangerous trails. Mara told her. Bethany listened. Orson listened. The Quayle children listened. The story of Rose Peters, the woman who built rooms because the world outside them was cruel, spread down the ridge that week. It traveled the way useful stories travel, not as legend, but as instruction. Build the room, stock the shelf, leave it open. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built before the storm arrives. Beam's response came fast. He posted a notice at his store, written in his careful hand, claiming that the caches near Prairie Creek Crossing and on the upper ridge sat on land subject to timber access agreements he held. Use of these structures, the notice said, required his written permission. Unauthorized stocking of supplies constituted trespass. The notice was a lie. Martha had been right. Rose's Hollow sat on public land above the claim line, and the second cache was on a creek easement that no one held title to. But Beam knew that most people on the ridge could not afford to challenge a paper, and a paper posted in a store carried the weight of authority even when it carried no legal force. He also began spreading a different kind of poison. He told people at the store that Mara was hiding stolen food in the caches, flour and salt taken from wagons and blamed on animals. He told people that Martha Peters was trespassing on land now under white claim, and that her presence on the ridge violated settlement boundaries that decent families should enforce. The first rumor was absurd. The second was dangerous. Not because it was true, but because it touched a fear that some settlers carried and few spoke about openly. The fear that the native families who had lived on this land for thousands of years might reclaim it through influence, if not through law. Martha heard the rumor from a ridge woman who repeated it with the embarrassed tone of someone who knew it was wrong but felt obligated to pass it along. Martha said nothing in response. She went to the cache the next day and restocked the food shelf, walking the trail in plain daylight with her canvas bag over her shoulder and her crooked knife in her belt. The community's answer came not through confrontation, but through refusal. The families who had survived the storm, who had felt the warmth of the hollow, who had watched their smokehouses hold heat for the first time, who had seen a baby born in a cache that existed because someone had thought about strangers, refused to cooperate with Beam's notice. No one asked his permission. No one acknowledged the paper. Deckard, who had laughed the loudest, took the notice down from the store wall when Beam was out, folded it, and left it on the counter with a sack of pitchwood knots he had gathered for the cache. Beam could pressure individuals. He could not pressure a community that had decided, without a vote or a meeting, that the woman in the stump had been right and the man in the store had been wrong. But Martha was getting weaker, and Mara could see that the winter's real cost was not going to be measured in cords or dollars or papers. It was going to be measured in the distance between a woman who had taught her everything and the morning when that woman would no longer walk the trail. The caches were stocked. The knowledge was spreading. The community was holding, and Martha Peters was coughing blood into a cloth she kept in her bag and would not show anyone because the work was not finished, and she did not have time to be dying. Martha Peters died on a clear, cold morning in January, the second winter since Mara had crawled into Rose's hollow with bleeding hands and no idea what she was touching. There was no storm, no dramatic wind, no crisis that demanded one more walk up the ridge. The sky was pale blue, and the air was still, and the frost on the fern tips caught the early light like glass. Martha was in her plank house near the mouth of Redwood Creek, wrapped in a blanket that Mara had helped her weave from wool and tulle fiber during the autumn months when Martha's hands could still work, but her lungs could not carry her up the trail. Mara was there. She had been there for 3 days, sleeping on the floor beside Martha's cot, feeding the fire, heating broth that Martha drank less of each morning. Martha's daughter and grandchildren were in the house too, quiet and attentive in the way that families become when the waiting has gone on long enough, the grief has already started, and the body is simply catching up. Martha did not make speeches. She had never made speeches. But on the last morning, she opened her eyes and looked at Mara and said, "Rose's name stays on the first room." Mara said, "It will. And the ledger goes to you, not because you own it, because you will write in it honestly." Mara took the canvas bag from beside the cot. The ledger was inside, along with the crooked knife, 3 coils of cordage, and a bundle of dried tulle that Martha had cured the previous summer. The bag smelled like cedar bark and charcoal, and the particular scent of Martha's hands, wood smoke and plant fiber, and the faint sweetness of bay leaves. Martha closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, a jay called from the redwood behind the house, and the sound was so ordinary and so indifferent to what was happening inside that Mara felt her throat close around something she could not swallow. Martha Peters died with the morning light on the blanket and her daughter's hand on her arm, and the sound of the creek running below the house, as it had run before the settlers came and would run after everyone in the room was gone. Mara sat beside the cot for a long time after. She did not cry. She held the canvas bag in her lap and breathed the cedar bark smell and understood that the weight she was carrying now was not grief alone. It was responsibility. Martha had given her the ledger and the knife and the cordage not as keepsakes, but as tools, and tools exist to be used, and the work was not finished. She walked back to the ridge that afternoon. The trail was dry. The air was cold and clean. When she reached Rose's hollow, she crawled inside and sat on the pallet in the dark and listened to the silence that Martha had taught her to hear, the silence of still air inside thick walls, the silence that meant the wind could not follow. She opened the ledger and wrote the date and Martha's name and the words, "Keeper returned to the ground, practice continues." It was the only eulogy Martha would have tolerated. The winter that followed Martha's death was the winter that proved the system could survive without its builder. Mara worked through the short days with a focus that looked, from the outside, like stubbornness and felt, from the inside, like the only alternative to sitting in the hollow and letting the cold take the decision away from her. She was not the same woman who had arrived on the ridge with $12 and a dead husband. She was harder in places and softer in others, and the difference between the two was not always visible to the people around her. The first test came a week after the funeral. A family named Garrett, new to the ridge, had arrived in December with a wagon of furniture and no understanding of what the coast winter would do to a cabin that was not sealed. The husband had chinked the walls with dry moss that fell out after the first rain. The wife had stacked all their firewood green and dry together under a canvas that collected water instead of shedding it. Their stovepipe was too short, and every storm pushed smoke back into the house. Bethany told them about Mara. The Garrett wife walked up to the ridge on a wet morning and found Mara outside the hollow, splitting alder for the fuel shelf with an axe that Jonas had brought her from Oric, a proper axe, with a hickory handle and a head that held its edge. "I was told you could help us keep warm," the woman said. Mara set down the axe. She could hear Martha's voice in her head, the way you hear someone who has been speaking to you for months and then goes silent. Not the words, but the rhythm. The rhythm said, "Show, do not tell. Begin with the draft." "Bring a candle," Mara said. "I will come to your cabin this afternoon." She walked the Garrett cabin with a candle flame the way her father had walked a ship hull with a lantern. The flame bent at the door, the window, the floor joints, the pipe collar, and 6 places along the north wall where the moss chinking had dried and crumbled. 23 leaks. Mara counted them aloud so the Garretts could hear the number and understand the scale of what they were losing. "Every leak is a place where the wind is stealing your heat," Mara said. "You can burn 10 cords and still freeze if the wind takes it faster than the stove makes it." She showed them how to mix clay and bark fiber into chinking compound. She showed them how to separate their fuel by grade. She showed them the 2-layer baffle for the door. She did not mention Martha by name that first time. The words caught in her chest and would not come out. But when the Garrett wife asked where Mara had learned this, she said, "From a woman who knew more than I will ever know." Her name was Martha Peters, and she learned it from her aunt, whose name was Rose. The Garrett wife nodded and went back to mixing clay. She did not ask anything more, but the names had been said, and the names were part of the method. Mara built the 3rd cache in February. A hollow redwood near a washed-out bridge on the Lower Creek Road, where the trail crossed water that rose fast in storms and stranded travelers on the wrong bank. This one she built alone. No Martha to correct her tool cuts. No Martha to test the ventilation with punky bark and a sharp eye. Mara did the tests herself, lighting small fires inside the hollow and watching the smoke the way Martha had taught her, not just whether it exited, but how fast, and whether it curled or climbed, and what the curl told her about the draft balance. The 3rd cache was her best work. The mat door hung on the split redwood frame she had developed with Martha, pegged with hardwood dowels. The ember pan was clay, thick-walled, fired in Bethany's smokehouse. The vent was cut at the angle Martha had always insisted on, steep enough to draw, shallow enough to keep rain from running back in. The fuel shelf held 40 pounds of alder, 15 pounds of pitchwood, and bark tinder sealed in a cedar box. The food shelf held dried fish, acorn meal prepared the way Martha had taught Bethany, and smoked venison that Orson had contributed from a deer he had taken in late autumn. Mara carved the notched markers on the trail trees herself. 1 notch, 2 notches, 3. The language of the caches, readable by anyone who had been taught and invisible to anyone who had not. Jonas Rell helped her carry the fuel. The male rider had been a quiet presence on the ridge since before the first storm. He was the man who had watched Claude Beam press the debt paper across the counter while Mara's fingers tightened around her last coins. He was the man who had brought the storm warning that gave Mara 2 days to prepare. He carried mail and news and the small observations of a man who rode every trail on the ridge twice a week and noticed things that people who stayed in one place did not notice. He had started helping after Martha's death, not with grand gestures. He carried bundles of pitchwood on the back of his horse when he rode the ridge route. He brought news of which trails were washed out and which hollows were sound after storms. He carried the cache maps, not written maps, because written maps could be stolen, but coded marks scratched onto strips of bark that only the families who had learned the notch system could read. He did not court Mara. Courting was a word for parlors and dances and the kind of careful social performance that had no place on a ridge where survival was the first conversation, and everything else came after. What Jonas did was show up. He showed up with fuel on his horse. He showed up with news in his mouth. He showed up with his hands ready to carry whatever needed carrying. One afternoon in October, Mara was repairing a mat panel at the third cache when the wind picked up and rain began slanting through the canopy. Jonas was there, holding the frame steady while she retied the cordage. The rain soaked them both. The tule was slippery. Mara's fingers slipped on a knot, and the panel sagged, and Jonas caught the weight with one hand while she retied it, and neither of them spoke because speaking would have meant letting go. When the panel was secure, they sat inside the cache and waited out the squall. Jonas lit the ember pan with a single match. He had watched Mara do it enough times that the sequence was in his hands. Low draft open, vent clear, shavings on the pan, flame to shavings. Alder fed slowly. He did not ask permission. He did not check whether he was doing it right. He just did it, the way a person does something they have practiced by watching. Mara looked at the fire he had built and said, "Martha would have approved." Jonas said, "I never met her, but I have carried her work on my horse for a year, and I think I know what she expected." It was the first time they had spoken about anything that was not logistics or weather or trail conditions. The rain drummed on the bark outside. The fire burned small and clean. The air inside was still. Mara noticed the way you notice a wall that has stopped leaking, not with celebration, but with the quiet recognition that something is working. Spring came, and spring on the ridge did not mean relief. It meant rain that swelled the creeks to flood, trails that dissolved into mud rivers and stored food that molded if the cache seals were not checked. Mara walked the 3 caches every week, inspecting mats, clearing vents, replacing food that had spoiled, and recording everything in the ledger. The operation at full scale looked like this: 3 public caches on ridge routes, each stocked and maintained by the families who used them. 6 family smokehouses refitted with tool baffles and sealed drafts. 2 hollow redwoods protected from cutting by an informal agreement among the ridge settlers, not written, not legal, but understood. And every autumn, before the first heavy rains, a day when the families gathered and stocked the caches together. Adults carried wood and food. Children twisted cordage and learned the notch markers. Orson supervised the drainage work. Bethany managed the food preparation. Mara checked the ventilation. The stocking day became the closest thing the ridge had to a holiday. Not festive, practical. But the work done shoulder to shoulder carried a feeling that the ridge had not had before. The feeling of people who had agreed without a speech or a vote that they would not let strangers freeze if they could help it. Mara taught anyone who asked. She did not charge. She did not claim ownership. She was careful, always, to say where the knowledge came from. Rose Peters built the first room. Martha Peters kept it ready and taught me what I know. I am passing it forward because that was the rule. Some people heard the names and understood. Some people heard the names and forgot them. Mara said them anyway, every time, because Martha had asked her to, and because the names were part of the method, the way a foundation is part of a house. Remove the foundation, and the house stands for a while, but it stands on nothing. Tobin grew stronger through that spring. His cough faded as the baffled cabin held dry warmth through the wet months. He was 13 now, tall for his age, with his father's long hands and his sister's stubbornness. He had learned to twist cordage from Martha before she died, and he had learned to split redwood from watching Mara, and in the summer he began building something of his own, small redwood storage boxes with raised feet, fitted with lids that overlapped like the tool mats. The boxes were tight enough to keep moisture out and light enough to carry. He made 6 of them that summer and placed them in the caches for storing tinder and dried food. Mara looked at the boxes and saw Martha's philosophy built in miniature, simple materials, simple tools, replaceable by anyone. Tobin had understood the principle without being told, the way children understand things that adults have to argue about. Beam's reckoning came during the second autumn. He had spent the months since the storm notice trying to reassert his position on the ridge. The store still operated. People still bought flour and salt and nails. But the cordwood trade had collapsed. The families who had sealed their cabins and baffled their doors needed 4 cords instead of 6, and some needed 3. The families who maintained caches had emergency fuel that did not come from Beam's woodlot. The debt ledger that had been Beam's real source of power, the lever he used to pry claims loose from people who could not pay, was shrinking. Fewer families needed credit because fewer families were desperate. Beam did not become a better man because his scheme failed. He became a more reckless one. In October, when the first storms of the season began pushing up the coast, Beam loaded his wagon with timber access papers and rode the ridge trail to visit isolated claimants, families far from the settlement center, families who might not have heard about the caches or learned the baffle method, families who might still be desperate enough to sign. He went too far up the ridge and stayed too late. The storm that had been building offshore arrived faster than the old-timers had predicted. By mid-afternoon, the rain was heavy enough to turn the trail into a creek, and the wind was pushing hard enough to rock the wagon on the ruts. Beam's horse balked at a creek crossing, where the water was already knee-deep and rising. Beam tried to force it. The horse reared, broke a trace, and bolted down the trail toward lower ground with half the harness still attached. Beam was left on the wrong side of the creek with a wagon that was not going anywhere, a stack of papers that were getting wet, and a storm that was getting worse. He knew where the nearest shelter was. Everyone on the ridge knew by now. The notched markers on the trail trees pointed toward Rose's Hollow the way a compass points north, not because anyone had forced the knowledge, but because the knowledge had spread the way useful things spread, through need and repetition and the simple fact that it worked. Beam followed the markers. 1 notch, 2, 3. He reached the hollow as the light failed, his coat soaked through, his boots full of water, his hands too cold to strike a match. He crawled through the entrance and found the mat door and the sailcloth and the still air and the dry fuel on the shelf. He found the ember pan and the pitchwood and the cedar box with matches. He found the sleeping pallet and the drainage trench and the smooth walls that Rose Peters had scraped with a curved blade decades before any settler had filed a claim within 10 miles of the ridge. He could not light the fire. His hands shook too badly. The matches slipped from his fingers and fell into the bark dust on the floor. He tried again. A match struck, flared, and died when his hand trembled the flame away from the pitchwood shavings. A third match broke in half. He crouched in the dark and listened to the storm outside and pressed his shaking hands against the smooth inner wall that someone had prepared for him, not for him specifically, not for Claude Beam, who had kicked the reed bundle and posted the notice and sent Polk to steal the pitchwood, but for whoever came next, for the stranger. The redwood wall was not warm, but it was dry, and the air inside did not move, and the rain that hammered the forest outside did not reach this space because the mats held and the bark sealed, and the foot-thick walls of fire-hardened wood did what Mara Belvoss had said they would do the first time Beam had stood at this entrance and laughed. They stopped the wind. Beam sat in the dark for hours. He did not sleep. He did not light the fire. He sat with his back against the wall and his ruined papers around his ankles and waited for morning or death, and morning came first, as it usually does when the room is dry and the body is not yet too far gone. Mara found him at dawn. She had walked the ridge at first light to check the caches after the storm, as she always did. She saw the abandoned wagon at the crossing and followed the boot prints, already filling with rain, to the hollow. She pulled the mat door aside and found Beam sitting against the far wall, his knees drawn up, his paper scattered on the floor around him, his face gray. He looked at her and waited. Mara could see what he expected. He expected anger. He expected her to say what he deserved to hear, that the man who had tried to lock the door was saved by the door being open, that the man who had stolen her pitchwood and threatened her claim and spread rumors about Martha had been kept alive by the woman he had dismissed and the legacy he had tried to own. She did not say it. She lit the ember pan. She warmed broth from the food shelf. She handed him a cup and waited while he drank. When Orson arrived an hour later, leading Beam's recovered horse, he looked at Beam sitting in the hollow that Beam had once kicked a reed bundle out of and said, "Well?" Beam said nothing. "You are going to tell people what happened," Orson said. It was not a request. Orson's voice carried the authority of a man who had been wrong once and corrected himself publicly, and would not tolerate less from a man who had been wrong longer and louder. What happened?" Beam said, and his voice was thin and rough. "Is that I lived because the place I wanted locked was open." Orson made him repeat it at the store, in front of Deckard, in front of Bethany, in front of the Parrish family and the Quayle family, and the 3 men from the lower ridge who had helped stock the cache that Beam had slept in. Beam said the words, and the words did not make him a good man or a changed man, but they took something from him that he could not get back. The ability to pretend that the caches were foolish, or that Martha had been trespassing, or that Mara had been furnishing a stump. The debt papers on Mara's timber access disappeared from Beam's ledger that week. He did not sign a release, he simply stopped pressing the claim. The community had made it clear, through the kind of steady, wordless pressure that is more effective than any document, that a man who had been saved by the thing he tried to destroy did not get to keep profiting from the people who had built it. Beam stayed on the ridge through the winter. He kept the store open. People still bought his flour and nails, but the cordwood line in his ledger stayed short, and the credit column stayed thin, and the man who had once controlled the ridge through debt now operated a store and nothing more. It was not redemption. It was reduction, and it was enough. Jonas Rell asked Mara whether she wanted company on the ridge on an evening in late November, the kind of evening where the rain had paused and the air smelled like wet redwood bark, and the last light turned the fog gold above the creek. They were standing outside the second cache near Prairie Creek Crossing, where Mara had just finished replacing a mat panel that the autumn rain had worn through. Jonas had carried the replacement mat on his horse and had helped her hang it, holding the upper edge while she tied the cordage, his hands steady on the wet tool while hers worked the knots. He did not say anything romantic. He said, "You should not be walking these trails alone after dark, and I ride them anyway." Mara looked at him. She looked at his hands, which were holding a bundle of tulle that she had given him to carry. She looked at his horse, which was patient and familiar with the ridge trails. She looked at his face, which was the face of a man who had been showing up for a year without asking for anything and was now asking for the smallest thing a person could ask for: presents. She said, "Carry that bundle to the third cache before the rain starts again. I will walk with you." It was not a declaration. It was a beginning. The kind of beginning that happens between people who have already been working together long enough that the work itself has said most of what needs saying. They married in the spring, quietly, in Bethany's parlor with Orson as witness and Tobin holding a bundle of wildflowers he had picked from the ridge meadow. There was no ceremony beyond the words. There did not need to be. Mara had learned from Martha that the things that mattered most were built through practice, not performance, and a marriage built on shared work did not require a stage. Jonas moved into the cabin on the ridge. He brought his horse, his mail bags, and a way of being in a house that Mara had not experienced since her father, the quiet competence of a man who sees what needs doing and does it without narration. He repaired the cabin roof. He replaced the stoveplate with one he had traded for in Oric. He built a proper woodshed with a raised floor and a shingled roof that kept the fuel dry. The years compressed the way years do when the days are full of work that matters. Tobin grew into a carpenter. He built raised, dry storage boxes for every cache on the ridge, and the boxes were so well made that they lasted longer than the hollows they sat in. He married a Garrett daughter, the family Mara had taught to seal their cabin that first winter after Martha died, and they built a house on the lower ridge with walls so tight that Mara tested them with a candle and could not find a single leak. Bethany's children became the first to teach the candle draft test to newcomers who arrived on the ridge without knowing what the notched markers meant. The oldest Pike girl, the one who had left the sailcloth anonymously beside the trail, became a teacher in the settlement school and taught the mercy rule as part of the winter preparation lessons. Take what keeps life, leave what keeps another. She kept a tule mat in the schoolroom, hung on the wall beside the chalkboard so the children could see the overlap pattern and touch the cordage and understand that the thing they were learning was made from the ground they walked on. Mara and Jonas had 2 children, a daughter, born in the cabin on the ridge during a storm that tested the baffled walls and found them holding, a son, born in summer, quiet and watchful like his father. Both learned the notch system before they learned to read. Both could light an ember pan in the dark by the time they were 10. The knowledge passed through their hands the way it had passed through Martha's hands and Rose's hands and Mara's hands, not as information stored in a book, but as practice stored in the body. Orson died in the 4th winter after the great storm, sitting in his chair beside the stove with a cup of broth going cold on the table, and the gray mule standing at the hitching post waiting for a ride that would not come. The ridge buried him on the south slope where the light was good, and Mara carved a single notch on the marker post beside his grave. It meant fuel. It was the closest thing to a compliment Orson would have accepted. His apology line lived on after him. "I counted cords. You counted what the wind could steal." People repeated it on stocking days and during storms when the caches held and the method worked. It became the kind of saying that loses its origin and becomes wisdom, the words of a man who had been wrong and had been large enough to say so. Beam left the ridge the following year. He sold the store to Deckard's brother-in-law and moved south toward San Francisco, where the debts were bigger, and the men who held them did not have to face the people they pressed. No one mourned his departure. No one celebrated it. He had been reduced, and the reduction was complete, and the ridge moved on. Mara aged into the role Martha had once held. She was not the owner of the knowledge. She was the keeper of the practice. She walked the caches each autumn and checked the mats and tested the vents and wrote in the ledger that Martha had given her. She trained new keepers, women and men who understood that the job was not authority, but attention. watch the mats, stock the fuel, keep the door open, write honestly what was taken and what was returned. She carried the crooked knife in her belt the way Martha had carried it. She never used it as well as Martha had. She did not need to. She used it well enough. By the time Mara Belvoss was old, 7 Ridge families knew how to build wind baffles, dry shelves, and emergency caches from materials that grew in the ground around them. 3 hollow redwoods stood on the ridge trails, stocked each autumn with pitchwood on the left shelf, dry alder on the right, food sealed high and dry, mats rolled above the floor line. 1 notch meant fuel, 2 meant food, 3 meant shelter. The original hollow, Rose's room, was never turned into a curiosity or a landmark. It remained what Rose had built it to be, a place that was ready for the next person who needed it. Mara lived out her later years on the same ridge she had nearly lost, in the cabin that Jonas had made tight and warm, and that mattered less, in the end, than the practice she had helped carry forward. She died in the early spring of 1909, after a wet winter that tested the caches one last time and found them holding. She left Tobin the cabin. She left Rose's hollow to no one, because the point was that no one owned it. The ledger she left to Bethany's oldest daughter, who had been the first child Martha taught to cut tule, and who now kept the entries in a hand as careful and slow as Martha's had been. Orson Vale had stood on that ridge in the autumn of 1887 and looked at a young woman splitting wet alder with a dull axe and said, "That stove will eat a cord before March, and you have not got March." He was right about the stove. He was right about the cords. He was wrong about what a woman could build when the cords were not enough, and March was not waiting. 50 years later, a stranger caught in sleet on the ridge above Redwood Creek followed 3 notches carved into the bark of a trailside redwood, crawled through a blackened triangular opening, and found dry mats, split kindling, and a small carved sign nailed to the inner wall. "Take what keeps life. Leave what keeps another." The stranger lit a fire that caught on the first match. The smoke climbed to the vent and exited. The air inside was still. The wind outside could not follow.